and I only hit Vince one time. I hit him with an uppercut, broke my hand right here, broke a bone in my hand, and knocked him out, completely out cold.
There is a line in professional wrestling that almost nobody ever crosses. It is the line between what is real and what is not, between the character on the screen and the person underneath, between the script and the truth. For most performers, that line is sacred. They protect it their entire careers. It is how the industry survives. It is how the illusion holds together. Break it and you risk everything. But in 1997, one man crossed it 5 times, and each time he did, the entire industry shook. His name was Bret Hart. They called him the hitman, the excellence of execution, a man who had dedicated his life to the craft of professional wrestling with a precision that bordered on obsession. He was the son of Stu Hart, trained in a dungeon in Calgary, while forged in a tradition that valued honor and technical excellence above everything else. He had carried the WWF Championship to 5 continents. He had been the company's representative to the world at a time when the world was still deciding whether professional wrestling deserved to be taken seriously as entertainment. He was not supposed to snap. He was supposed to be the adult in the room. He always had been. But the WWF in 1997 was not a room that rewarded restraint. It was a company in genuine crisis, leading viewers to Ted Turner's WCW in a ratings war that many people inside the industry believed the WWF was going to lose permanently. The organization was scrambling to reinvent itself. It was trading tradition for chaos, swapping the moral clarity of its new generation era for something raw and more confrontational and considerably less comfortable for a man like Bret Hart. And as the company changed around him, the goalposts kept moving. Promises kept getting broken. The respect that he had spent 14 years earning started to feel like something that could be taken back at any moment, without warning, without apology, without consequence. When that happens to most people, they adjust. They absorb the change. They find a way to keep going professionally even when the personal cost starts to mount. Bret Hart was not most people. The result was 5 moments that the WWF could not script, could not control, and could not erase. 5 explosions of genuine, unfiltered human rage that changed the direction of an industry. And these were not worked angles designed to blur the line between fiction and reality. These were not carefully planned moments of scripted authenticity. These were real. If you have ever wanted to understand how one man brought an entire corporation to its knees, you are in the right place. Make sure you are subscribed and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. This story is going to take a while, and every word of it is worth your time. Number 5, Syracuse, New York, March 17th, 1997. The night that professional wrestling stopped being able to pretend it had everything under control. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the months that came before it. Bret Hart had returned to the WWF at Survivor Series 1996 after a brief time away from the company. He came back with his reputation intact, honor, his work rate unmatched, and a belief that the organization he had given so much to would treat him with the respect he had earned. He was the hitman, the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. He had said those words so many times that he had started to believe them, not as a catchphrase, but as a simple statement of fact. And for a while, it looked like the WWF agreed. He was placed back into the main event almost immediately. He was positioned as the reliable, dependable champion figure that the company could build around. But the business had changed while he was gone, and not in a way that was comfortable for a man who prided himself on being the moral backbone of the locker room. Stone Cold Steve Austin was on the rise. The crowd was changing. The fans who used to cheer for Bret's technical mastery were now losing their minds over Austin's defiance and raw aggression. The WWF was leaning into that change, and in doing so, they were slowly pushing Bret Hart to the side. Not in one dramatic decision, but in 100 small choices that added up to something that felt to Bret like a slow and deliberate betrayal. The Royal Rumble in January had been the first real wound. Bret had eliminated Austin cleanly. The moment should have been his, but Austin had sneaked back into the ring. The referees had missed it, and by the time the dust settled, it was Austin heading to WrestleMania. It was a booking decision. Everyone in the building knew that, but for Bret, it felt like a message. Then came Final Four in February. For 24 hours, Bret Hart was the WWF champion. He had won the title. He had earned it. And then, within a single day, it was taken from him again in circumstances that left him looking like a man who could not hold on to what was rightfully his. By the time March arrived, Bret Bret Hart was carrying months of frustration inside him. He was still performing at the highest level. He was still giving everything he had every single night, but the rewards had stopped coming, the respect had started to erode, and on the night of March 17th in Syracuse, all of it came out. The steel cage match against Psycho Sid was supposed to be the final piece of setup before WrestleMania 13. Bret was meant to lose, and losing was part of the story. What was not part of the story was the manner in which the loss came. Austin interfered. The Undertaker interfered. A chaos piled on chaos until the conclusion felt less like a wrestling match and more like the company laughing openly at the man in the middle of the ring. When it was over, Vince McMahon came down for an interview. This was standard procedure. McMahon was still primarily known to the audience as the play-by-play announcer, the voice of the WWF. He was not yet the villain. He was not yet Mr. McMahon. He was just the announcer with the microphone coming down to get a few words from the frustrated hero. What he got instead was a shove, a hard, real shove that sent him stumbling backward and onto the mat. And then came the words that no one in that production truck was remotely ready for. Bret Hart looked into the camera with the live audience watching and with the broadcast going out uncut to television screens across the country. And he said exactly what he thought. He called it what he believed it was. He used the kind of language that simply did not happen on WWF television in 1997. He said that he was not just frustrated, he said this was something else entirely. And he did not say it quietly. He said it loudly, repeatedly, with the full force of a man who had reached the end of his patience and no longer had any interest in protecting the presentation. The production team had no way to stop it. There was no delay on the broadcast. There was no mute button. The profanity went out live to every household watching Monday Night Raw, and the organization could not take it back. The aftermath was immediate and permanent. The WWF was forced to implement a 7 to 15 second broadcast delay for Raw that has been in place ever since. And a single uncontrolled outburst by one man forced the company to permanently change how it broadcast its flagship program. That is how real the moment was. That is how completely unprepared the organization had been for the possibility that one of its performers might simply say what he actually thought. But there was a second consequence that took longer to reveal itself. The sight of Vince McMahon being physically shoved by the company's former role model, stumbling backward in his suit, looking genuinely startled and humiliated in front of a live audience, planted a seed. The audience had seen something raw that night. They had seen the announcer taken down by the talent. They had seen the curtain move, and somewhere in Vince McMahon's mind, a character had begun to take shape. Not yet, but soon. In the Syracuse outburst was the moment Bret Hart's transformation from hero to something far more complicated truly began. The audience in that arena had started to shift. They were beginning to see his complaints not as righteous grievances, but as the bitter frustration of a man who could not accept a changing world. This was a significant development because Bret's entire identity as a performer had been built on audience sympathy. He was the man the fans were supposed to root for. He was the role model. He was the good guy in a business full of gray areas. The moment the crowd in Syracuse started turning on him, even slightly, even tentatively, something fundamental had changed in the equation. It is worth noting what that shift looked like in practice. The fans did not boo him loudly or uniformly. It was more subtle than that. There were jeers mixed in with cheers. There were sections of the arena that clearly found his outburst entertaining in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy. The same crowd that had once adored his championship matches were now laughing at his frustration rather than sharing it. That gap between the performer and the audience, once it opens, almost never closes again. Stone Cold Steve Austin was in that building that night, and the contrast could not have been more pointed. Where Bret raged with the indignation of a man who believed the rules should be followed, Austin represented a man who had decided the rules did not apply to him and was openly, joyfully making that point every time he appeared on screen. The audience was choosing its own side in a conflict they had not fully articulated yet, and they were not choosing Bret. That shift would accelerate dramatically in the months ahead. But on this night, the loudest sound in the building was the one that came from Bret's own mouth, and it was not scripted by anyone. Number 4, Hartford, Connecticut, June 9th, 1997. The night professional wrestling had a genuine, unsupervised physical altercation less than an hour before a live television broadcast. The night the thin wall between personal grievance and professional conduct collapsed entirely and took a lot of other things down with it. The relationship between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels was already one of the most complicated in the history of the business by this point. These were two men who had competed at the highest level together, who had traded the championship back and forth, who understood each other's work in the ring better than almost anyone else alive. They were peers. In another time, another context, they might have been allies, but they were not allies. They were not close to anything resembling mutual respect by the summer of 1997. The rivalry between them had moved well beyond professional disagreement into something genuinely personal. There were real grievances on both sides. There was real animosity. And in a business where personal feelings and professional obligations are forced to coexist in the same small locker room every single week, that combination was always going to explode eventually. The fuse was lit on May 19, 1997. Shawn Michaels was on the microphone during an episode of Raw is War, delivering a promo that was supposed to build character tension. He was always comfortable on the microphone. He was always sharp, always willing to push further than anyone else would dare. And on this particular night, he decided to push in a direction that no one had given him permission to go. He looked into the camera and said it. He told Bret Hart that he had been having sunny days. Anyone watching who understood the reference knew immediately what was being implied. It was a direct, public insinuation that Bret Hart was having an affair with WWF performer Sunny, whose real name was Tammy Sytch. It was not in the script. It had not been approved. Former head writer Vince Russo later confirmed that Michaels had gone entirely into business for himself, using the live broadcast to air a personal attack under the cover of in-character trash talk. The damage it caused was not merely professional. Our Bret Hart's marriage was already under strain. His personal life was not a prop to be used on television, and having the insinuation broadcast to millions of viewers was not something that could be undone with an apology or a retraction. It was out there. It was on tape, and it had caused genuine harm to real people in Bret's personal life. Bret Hart was furious, not character furious, not worked furious, genuinely, completely furious in a way that could not be contained backstage or managed by the usual mechanisms of the wrestling business. He viewed the comment as an unforgivable breach. There was a code in that locker room, an unspoken agreement that personal lives stayed personal, that what happened outside the ring stayed outside the ring. Michaels had shattered that code on live television in front of millions of people. He had done it deliberately, and Bret Hart was not going to let it pass. The confrontation came on June 9th, less than an hour before Raw went live from Hartford. Bret Hart found Shawn Michaels backstage and confronted him directly. The words that were exchanged are not fully documented, but what happened next absolutely is. The situation escalated past conversation and into physical violence with the kind of speed that only genuinely personal conflicts can produce. Eyewitness accounts from Jim Ross and Pat Patterson describe a chaotic and frantic scene. Bret Hart had Michaels down on the floor. He was ripping at him, tearing at him, refusing to let go. And then came the moment that became the most remembered detail of the entire incident. Bret grabbed Shawn Michaels by his signature long ponytail and pulled. He did not pull gently. He pulled hard enough to rip a large clump of hair directly from Michaels' head, leaving a visible bald spot that no amount of careful styling could conceal. The veteran officials who tried to separate them did not have an easy time of it. Pat Patterson and Jerry Briscoe were both knocked to the floor in the process. These were experienced men who had spent their entire careers around professional wrestling and its volatile personalities. The fact that they could not immediately pull two performers apart gives you some indication of how completely out of control the situation had become. When it was finally over, Shawn Michaels was in no condition to perform. He was loudly claiming unsafe working conditions. He was announcing that he was quitting the WWF on the spot and flying to Boston to appear on WCW Nitro that same night. So crossing directly to the competition in a move that would have been a devastating blow to the WWF's narrative and its public credibility. Vince McMahon had a full-scale crisis on his hands less than 60 minutes before the broadcast began. The main event had been advertised for weeks. The entire script for the evening had been built around a specific match, and now one of the two men scheduled to compete in that match had walked out of the arena, claiming the building was not safe to work in. McMahon scrapped the entire script. Mankind was brought in at the last possible moment to fill the main event slot. The audience at home saw a completely different show from the one that had been planned, and they had no way of knowing how narrowly the whole evening had avoided total collapse. Syracuse McMahon spent the early part of that broadcast managing the fallout from a fight that had happened in his own building, reassuring agents and officials and talent while simultaneously trying to project calm to a television audience that sensed something was wrong without being able to name it. What also gets lost in discussions of Hartford is the toll the incident took on the wider locker room. Professional wrestling functions on a set of unspoken agreements between the performers, and one of those agreements is that personal business stays personal. What Michaels had done on the microphone with the Sunny Days comment had violated that agreement. What Bret had done in the locker room in response had created a new new problem. Now people were choosing sides. Now the agents and officials and mid-card talents had to navigate a working environment in which two of the top performers genuinely hated each other and had proven they were willing to be physically violent about it. That is not a comfortable place to work. And the discomfort radiated outward from that Hartford corridor into every aspect of the organization's operations for the months that followed. The Hartford locker room fight was significant for reasons beyond the immediate disruption it caused. It was the moment that made any peaceful resolution between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels truly impossible. Whatever slim chance had remained of the two men finding a professional understanding had been destroyed in that room. From Hartford onwards, there was only one direction this story was heading, and it was heading to Montreal. Key number 3, Montreal, Quebec, Canada, November 9th, 1997. The single most debated, most analyzed, and most talked about moment in the entire history of professional wrestling. The Montreal Screwjob is usually discussed from the angle of what Vince McMahon planned and executed, the conspiracy, the way McMahon, Shawn Michaels, and referee Earl Hebner worked together to end the match on terms that Bret Hart had never agreed to and had never been told about. That part of the story is well documented and has been examined from every possible angle in the decades since it happened. But what is sometimes lost in that conversation is what Bret Hart did immediately afterwards. Because what McMahon orchestrated was a corporate decision made by a man in a suit. What Bret Hart did in response was raw, entirely unplanned, passing completely beyond the organization's ability to manage. And it was broadcast live to a global pay-per-view audience who had paid full price to watch the WWF's Survivor Series. To understand the full weight of what happened, you need to know what had been agreed beforehand. Bret Hart had signed a 20-year contract with the WWF in 1996. It was, by the standards of the industry at the time, an extraordinary commitment. 20 years. It was a statement of permanence, a binding of Bret Hart's professional future to the organization he had given his entire career to. By 1997, McMahon had approached him and admitted the company was in serious financial difficulty and could no longer afford to honor the terms of that deal. He encouraged Bret to explore his options with WCW. Bret did exactly that. Curran and WCW offered him $3 million a year with meaningful creative control over his own character. It was an offer that no rational person could refuse. Bret accepted it. The problem was the WWF Championship. Bret held the title. The Survivor Series was being held in Montreal, which was effectively Bret's home country, and he did not want to lose the championship there. His contract contained a clause granting him reasonable creative control in the final 30 days before his departure. He used that clause to push back against the proposed finish. He was not refusing to lose the championship at all. He was refusing to lose it in Montreal to Shawn Michaels in a way that would humiliate him in front of his home crowd. He proposed alternatives. He was willing to relinquish the belt on Raw the next night. He was willing to work something dignified. He just would not lie down in Montreal. McMahon agreed. He sat down with Bret privately in the days before the Survivor Series and gave him his personal assurance. The match would end in a disqualification or a draw. Bret would leave Montreal without losing the title and would relinquish it under controlled circumstances the following night on Raw. McMahon looked him in the eye and gave his word. It was a lie, and the lie was executed with precision. The match began. Both men worked through it professionally. Then Michaels applied Bret's own finishing move, the sharpshooter, against him. The crowd in Montreal held its breath, and referee Earl Hebner looked down at the hold and called for the bell. He called for the bell while Bret Hart had not submitted, while Bret's shoulders had not touched the mat in defeat, while Bret had given no signal whatsoever that he was giving in. The bell rang. The music played. Shawn Michaels was announced as the new champion, and Bret Hart stood in the middle of that ring in Montreal in front of his home crowd and understood in a single, terrible instant exactly what had just happened to him. What followed was not in any script. First, the spit. McMahon was at ringside. Bret Hart turned to face the man who had once been something close to a father figure to him, the man who had just betrayed him publicly in his own country, and he spat directly into his face. This was not a theatrical gesture. This was not a wrestling spit. It was a real, deliberate act of contempt from a man who now held nothing but contempt for the person standing in front of him. Then came the equipment. Bret Hart moved around the ringside area and systematically destroyed the television monitors and broadcast equipment. He smashed them and threw them and pulled them apart one piece at a time. Each one carried a real cost for the organization. Bret was not performing destruction. He was genuinely committing it. And then came the most pointed act of all. Before leaving the ring, with the cameras still rolling and the pay-per-view audience still watching, Bret Hart raised his finger and traced 3 letters in the air. WCW. He named his destination on WWF pay-per-view in direct violation of the company's strict policy against acknowledging the competition on its own programming. He told the entire watching world exactly where he was going. He took the very thing the screw job was designed to prevent, was the appearance of a WWF champion departing for WCW with his head held high, and he made it happen anyway, just without the title belt. Think about the audacity of that gesture for a moment. The entire rationale that McMahon would later offer for the screw job was that he could not allow Bret Hart to take the WWF championship to WCW and embarrass the company on its rivals' programming. That was the justification. That was the business logic. And in the span of about 30 seconds, Bret Hart had made that logic irrelevant. He had told the audience exactly what was happening, exactly where he was going, and exactly what he thought of the company that had done this to him. The cover story was shredded before it had even been written. The crowd in Montreal had initially been confused by the finish. Something felt wrong, but they could not immediately articulate what. The atmosphere in the building shifted from confusion into something heavier and more unsettling as the seconds passed. Wrestling crowds are experienced at processing unusual endings. They have seen hundreds of screwy finishes across thousands of shows, but this felt different. The energy coming off the performers in the ring was not the energy of a worked moment. It was the energy of something real. And the Montreal crowd, Bret Hart's crowd in Bret Hart's country, felt it. And then, as the realization spread through the building that what they had just witnessed was not a storyline, but a real betrayal, the response shifted into something the WWF had never produced intentionally. The fans turned completely on the organization. They understood that a performer they loved had been lied to and publicly humiliated by the very company they were paying to support. And Bret Hart, standing in the wreckage of the ringside area, covered in the debris of his own rebellion, became in that moment something that no creative team could have scripted. He became genuinely, undeniably righteous. He became real. The Montreal in-ring rebellion did not just mark the end of Bret Hart's 14-year career with the WWF. It marked the end of an entire era. The pretense that the organization was a morally clean operation, that its good guys were genuinely good, and its villains were manageable, and the whole structure was trustworthy, collapsed in that arena. What replaced it was something harder and more cynical, and ultimately far more compelling. And the audience had seen behind the curtain, and they could never unsee it. Number 2, still Montreal. Still November 9th, 1997. But this time behind closed doors, away from the cameras, in a locker room where no one was performing for an audience. What happened in the ring at Survivor Series was the public face of Bret Hart's fury. What happened in the dressing room afterwards was the private one, and it was, by almost any measure, even more significant in terms of what it would go on to produce. After the match, McMahon made the rational decision. He took Gerald Briscoe and Shane McMahon, and they locked themselves in a backstage office. They stayed out of the way and waited for the immediate temperature to drop. Bret Hart was still in his wrestling gear, still processing what had just happened, still operating at a level of genuine rage that most human beings never reach in their entire lives. Staying away from him was the sensible choice, but McMahon could not leave it alone. Eventually, he decided to go to the locker room. He said he wanted to clear the air. He wanted to explain his decision. He wanted to make Bret understand why he had done what he did, to frame the betrayal as a painful but necessary act of corporate survival rather than a personal attack. He would tell Bret that he had done it to protect his company from WCW owner Eric Bischoff, who he believed would have used Bret and the championship as a weapon against him if given any opportunity to do so. Bret Hart gave him a warning. It was direct and it was clear. Leave. Do not come into this room. If you walk through that door, you're going to get hurt. Now, that was not a figure of speech. That was an explicit statement of intent from a man who had been a professional wrestler for over 2 decades and who was, in that moment, operating entirely on genuine emotion with none of the trained restraint that usually governed his conduct. McMahon came through the door anyway. What happened in the next second has been described by Bret Hart himself in multiple interviews across the years since. He delivered a single punch, one shot, a precise, powerful uppercut to the temple. By Hart's own account, and by the accounts of those who were present in that room, the force of the punch lifted McMahon off the floor. Not as a figure of speech, physically, off the floor. Vince McMahon was unconscious before he finished falling. He was out cold on the floor of that dressing room for approximately 5 minutes. Shane McMahon attempted to intervene, but there was nothing to intervene in. The punch had already landed. The damage was already done. All anyone could do was stand around and wait for the man on the floor to come back to consciousness. At one point, McMahon reportedly stirred just enough to verbally confirm he would honor the remaining financial obligations in Bret's contract, and then he went back under. He confirmed what he owed while barely conscious on a locker room floor. Bret Hart broke his own hand delivering that punch. The force required to knock a grown man unconscious with a single blow is not trivial, and the impact fractured bones in his own fist. He would carry that injury into his debut for WCW, and it hampered his ability to perform for weeks afterwards. He has described the pain as entirely barely worth it. He has called it, more than once, the sweetest thing he ever did. The evidence was impossible to hide. McMahon appeared on Raw the following week with a genuinely blackened, swollen eye. This was not theatrical makeup applied by a production team for dramatic effect. This was real physical damage sustained in a real confrontation in a private room after a pay-per-view event. The audience watching at home assumed it was part of the character development. They had no reason to believe otherwise. Number one, and this one is different from all the others, because it did not happen in a single moment. It happened across an entire year. And it was captured on film by someone who had been granted access before anyone could have anticipated what that access would eventually document. His name was Paul J. He was an independent filmmaker who had been given extraordinary fly-on-the-wall access to Bret Hart throughout the whole of 1997. The WWF had agreed to allow him to follow Hart as a documentary subject, capturing his daily life and his preparation and his matches and his professional relationships across the course of what was supposed to be a triumphant and celebratory year. The assumption on the part of the organization was clear. The final product would be a positive, celebratory document that reflected well on the excellence of execution and on the company that had made him famous. What Paul J. actually captured was a corporation in the process of systematically betraying one of its most loyal and longest-serving employees. And because he had been granted access before anyone knew quite how badly things were going to deteriorate, he was present for all of it. He was in the locker rooms. He was in the hallways. And he was there for conversations that were never intended to be witnessed by anyone with a camera. The single most important piece of footage he obtained was the private conversation between Vince McMahon and Bret Hart in the days before Survivor Series. This was not a press conference. This was not a public statement designed for an audience. This was McMahon in a private setting, giving Bret Hart his personal word about how the match in Montreal would conclude. And on that recording, McMahon stated plainly that the match would end without a clean fall. He confirmed that Bret would not lose the WWF Championship in Canada. He said those words to a man who trusted him, knowing as he said them that they were not true. When the screwjob was executed and the truth emerged, and that recording became something the WWF had no legal or practical framework to contain. It was not a rumor. It was not a wrestler making accusations in an interview years after the fact. It was the voice of the chairman of the company, preserved on audio tape, recorded in advance of the event in question, directly contradicting every version of events the organization would go on to present publicly. McMahon would claim he had protected his business. He would construct a narrative of reluctant necessity, of a painful decision made in difficult circumstances to prevent a vindictive competitor from weaponizing his champion. That narrative might have held without the documentary. With the documentary and with that recording, it could not stand. The tape was the truth, and the tape was not going anywhere. But the documentary captured something beyond the McMahon conversation. It captured something more human and more haunting in the corridors of the Molson Center in the immediate aftermath of the screwjob. Bret Hart's wife, Julie, was there that night. She had seen what happened to her husband. She had watched his career with the WWF end in public humiliation at the hands of the man he had trusted most in the business. And as Triple H and Shawn Michaels attempted to leave the arena, she found them in the corridor and she stopped them. Triple H stood there and swore to God he had known nothing about the plan. He said it over and over. And Julie Hart, who had seen too much by that point to accept denials at face value, Ida responded in words that had not been approved by any corporate communications department and had not been written by any creative team. She told him that someday God would strike him down. She told him that what goes around comes around. She said all of it directly to his face, with the camera recording every word. Triple H's reaction in that corridor became a permanent part of how wrestling fans remembered him. Viewers who watched Wrestling with Shadows and saw that scene formed conclusions about his character that stayed with him for years. Whether those conclusions were entirely fair is a question that people still debate. What is not up for debate is the fact that the WWF had zero ability to control what was captured on that film or what it looked like once an audience got the chance to see it. The organization tried to prevent the documentary from being released. McMahon refused to honor the stock footage waivers that had been agreed upon before the events of November 9th. He did not want this film to exist in the form that Paul J. had assembled. He did not want the world to have an independent, fly-on-the-wall record of the year that had just concluded. The legal conflict that followed was significant, and for a period it was genuinely unclear whether the documentary would ever reach its audience. But the filmmakers prevailed. Wrestling with Shadows was released, and it changed the relationship between professional wrestling and its audience in ways that have never been fully reversed. 5 moments. 5 times the organization lost its grip on the man it thought it owned. The broken hand, the fractured marriage, the grief that came with losing his brother Owen in 1999, a tragedy that arrived just as he was beginning to try to process the professional destruction of the 2 years before it, and that left him carrying carrying wounds that no amount of time has ever fully healed. The WCW run that never came close to reaching the heights it should have, hampered by injury and grief and the psychological weight of everything he had been through. A career that had been built on precision and care and an almost obsessive commitment to doing things the right way. Ending not with a triumphant final chapter, but with a series of real-world traumas that no performer should ever be asked to absorb. There is a particular kind of irony in the fact that Bret Hart spent his entire career trying to protect the integrity of the business, trying to uphold a standard of professionalism and honesty that he believed made professional wrestling worth taking seriously. And the moments in which the industry remembers him most clearly, the moments that defined his legacy in the broadest cultural sense, are the moments in which he completely lost control of himself. The moments when the standards broke, when the professionalism failed, when all that remained was a man in pain doing the only thing he knew how to do in that moment, which was to fight back. That is the cost of being the man who told the truth in an industry that runs on fiction. That is the legacy of the Hitman.